let me share my screen.
Yeah, perfect. So I'll just introduce for everyone. So myself, Chris from Oliver Bernard. We've got Ryan Howard today, who's going to give us an introduction to Playwright. Obviously, with everything that's gone on in the world over the last year or so, we've obviously moved to online meetups that we would traditionally do on site, really just to engage the community, keep everyone talking about what's new, and we're fortunate enough to have Ryan today talk about Playwright, which is a fairly new and modern technology which has a variety of uses. So yeah, Ryan, I'll hand over to you. One thing to note, if we can all remain on mute whilst Ryan is giving his presentation, there will be some time devoted to questions at the end. So if you want to note down any questions that you have at all, and we can drop them in the chat once Ryan's finished up. So Ryan, over to you.
Thank you. Just the obligatory check at the start. I assume everyone can hear me okay and see my screen.
Yeah, all good.
Cool. So thank you. Thanks everyone for coming, and thanks Chris for having me. Today I'm going to talk to you about Playwright. And in terms of what I'm going to present, it's very much kind of entry-level Playwright, an introduction to what it is, and I'll sort of precariously try and split this session in half. The first half, just a couple of slides to go through some of the core features of Playwright and some of the limitations, and then in the second half, we will have a look at installing and writing a quick test. For the purposes of this session, I'm going to be writing vanilla Playwright, if you were. So I'm not going to be combining it with any sort of frameworks or assertion libraries. It's going to be pure Playwright, which might not necessarily be the way you use it, but it's a good way of sort of demonstrating. So everything that I do is specific to Playwright, and not you know, you're not digging through sort of framework code to understand which bits are Playwright and which bits belong to the framework. So my name is Ryan. I am a software tester and have been in various ways for the last 10 years. I live in Norwich, which is in Norfolk. I'm not sure how many people are UK based on the call, so that's right on the East Coast. And I am the founder of How QA, which is a test consultancy which helps businesses we support businesses through their kind of testing requirements and needs. So I thought I'd start off with a quick statement of what is Playwright, and this is taken directly from their own documentation. So this is how the Playwright team describe Playwright, and they say Playwright is a Node.js library to automate Chromium, Firefox, and WebKit with a single API. Playwright is built to enable cross-browser web automation that is evergreen, capable, reliable, and fast. So if we just pull out a couple of things out of there. So Playwright is ultimately a web automation tool in much the same way Selenium is. It provides us with a set of features which allow us to interact with a web page much like a user would, and much like Selenium does. So all the things you'd expect to see in Selenium WebDriver, navigating to a page, entering text, clicking on buttons, that sort of thing. That's what Playwright is. It's trying to do the same thing. It's just coming at it from a slightly different angle. Also mentions there that it's able to run tests cross-browser with Chromium, Firefox, and WebKit, which we'll talk about a little bit more in the next slide. And that last statement, evergreen, capable, reliable, and fast. The whole idea behind Playwright is that it's built for modern web applications. So Playwright is Selenium is a great tool. It's been around for a really long time, and it will be around for a lot longer. Playwright, I think, because it's so new and it's spawned in an era where web applications have changed quite considerably. We now have a lot more single page applications, a lot more going on behind the scenes. It's definitely built to support automation for what I would call a modern web application, in building something like React or something like that. So there are a whole host of JavaScript libraries and frameworks and tools for testing web automation, writing web automated tests. So it's it might be a little bit surprising that we've got another one. And it kind of is. But as I mentioned previously, because it's so new, it's been able to introduce some features that are really specific to the way that modern web applications work. So just a quick overview of Playwright. So it originally started as a fork of the Puppeteer library. So Puppeteer is another web automation tool built by Google. Playwright is started as a fork of that. So syntactically, it's very similar. So if you use Puppeteer at all, then Playwright, you should be able to get started fairly quickly. It's developed by Microsoft. The story goes that I think it might even be the same team that worked on Puppeteer, who are now working for Microsoft. This is great because it's got backing behind it. It's completely open sourced. It's on GitHub. You can download the source code. So it's currently got close to 24,000 stars on GitHub. So it's becoming quite popular. It started as a Node library, and the code we'll be writing today is JavaScript. So we'll be using that Node library. But it now has language bindings for Java, Python, C#, and I think there are even some third-party language bindings for Golang, but I don't think that's supported by the core team. Again, this is really great because since Selenium, since Selenium WebDriver, we haven't had many tools which offer us the ability to write tests in different languages. So it's nice to have another option there, particularly for languages like Python, where we're slightly more limited to choice than we are with JavaScript. So version 1 was released about a year ago, so it's still fairly new. I think it's up to version 1.18, something like 13, 18. Something like that. So, but it's around a year old now. So here is a basic Playwright script, Playwright test. Like I mentioned earlier, I've stripped out any framework code. So everything you see here is specific to Playwright. Like I mentioned, if you've used Puppeteer before, it'll be pretty similar to that. And we can pick out some of the key things here. We'll go through it a bit more when we write the code. So initially, if I go to here, this is how we launch a browser instance. And in this instance, we're using the Chromium browser, and we're actually passing in some parameters here, which I can talk about in a minute. Playwright runs headlessly by default. So you have to pass in this headless false in order to see that on the screen. So we'll be using that in a little while, so you can actually see the test running. Once we've created a browser, we can create a page. So again, this will be very similar to anyone who's written sort of web automated tests before. Once you've got a browser instance, you can then launch a page. once we've got a page, we can actually navigate to where we want to go. So in this instance, we've got our endpoint here, which is a test to do application. Some of you may have used before. And then again, like we've seen with things like Selenium before, simple tasks like being able to fill in text, press buttons on the keyboard, and this instance obviously close the browser at the end. We can we're going to replicate this test in VS Code in a few minutes time, so we can see it running. So Playwright comes with a whole host of kind of core features. So I thought I'd just go through a few of them now, pick out some of the ones which make it, I think, a decent choice for test automation. So as I previously mentioned, it supports cross-browser testing-ish. So currently, Playwright supports testing on the WebKit driver, which is used by Safari. It also supports Firefox and the Chromium driver, which is used by the newer versions of Edge and obviously Google Chrome. So one of the things that Playwright does is it ships with instances of these drivers. So you don't have to have browsers installed on your application. If you want to run your tests against WebKit, you can just run them against WebKit, regardless of whether you're using Mac, Linux, or a Windows machine. Once you've installed Playwright, you have the ability to run against these drivers. So that does also mean that you're not running against specific browsers. So when we say you can run against Chromium driver, we are running against Chromium driver. We're not running against Google Chrome or IE. As I mentioned, the plus side of that is that you don't need to install browsers onto your machine. The downside is you're not running your tests against specific versions of Chrome or Edge or Firefox or Safari. And in fact, the drivers that get installed tend to be 1, 2, or maybe even 3 versions ahead of what the browsers are using. So it's quite a nice feature to be able to test your code on the newest versions of those drivers, which will be picked up by Google Chrome and Firefox in the future. The downside is that if you want to regression test, then you're not testing on the kind of the latest versions in the market. So Playwright supports multi-page testing, multiple tabs and iframes out of the box. And it does this using context. Now, context is a big part of the Playwright architecture. And the context is a almost incognito version, an incognito instance of a browser. And the reason they're so great is because they're very quick to spin up and they're very quick to destroy. So if you want to create multiple contexts in a test, you can do that. And each context hangs off of a single browser instance. So you only ever need to launch your browser once, and then you can launch multiple contexts off them. And they're completely independent. From each context, you can then launch multiple pages. So you could, in theory, have a browser with 2 contexts, and each of those contexts have 2 pages. And each of those pages could have frame instances below that. So you can see how you can dig down right into iframes off of a page. And as I mentioned, these contexts are really useful because they're so quick to spin up and destroy. They're also really helpful for particular testing scenarios. So the two that I've come across in use cases is one where you would like to test a scenario where one user opens up a document or a page on an application, and another user is unable to, the application should lock that document so no other user can access it while it's being edited. So you can do that using context. You could log in as 2 separate users. On your first context, you can access a page. On your second context, you can try and access that page, and hopefully you get the desired error or response. The other thing I've seen, which is quite interesting, is testing a chat application. So being able to load 2 contexts up, each with their chat open, and they can essentially chat to each other. So you can validate things like chat. Auto waiting for elements. So if people have used Selenium WebDriver before, you'll be fully aware of the pitfalls of your tests being quicker than applications. So when your application is trying to interact with a button or a field which hasn't currently finished loading, Playwright auto waits in the same way that something like Cypress does. And it actually goes through a checklist. So it's on that documentation. You can see the checks it does based on the type of element it's interacting with. So if it's interacting with a button, it's checking that it's completely loaded, it's checking that it's visible, it's checking that any animation is completed and that sort of thing. And it does all those checks before it even tries to interact with that element. Obviously, if those checks fail, then eventually it will time out. But it just gives your application a little bit of an opportunity to load before we try and interact with it. Stops you having to add your own sort of weights in tests. It's got a built-in test runner. So there is a Playwright test runner. It uses the describe type syntax that is used with test runners like Mocha. But the great thing is it's not limited to those. So in much like Selenium isn't limited to any framework or test runner, you can pick. So if you want to use Mocha, use Mocha. Jasmine, it's compatible with any of those. And that's maybe one of the pitfall or the disadvantages of using a tool like Cypress, where you are restricted to using Mocha. Auto element detection and chain element detection. And what I mean by this is that Playwright tries to interpret what type of element you're looking for with your selectors. So, for example, if your selector starts with a double slash, it's going to assume that is an XPath. So it's going to treat it as an XPath. Equally, if it starts with a hash, it might, assume it's a CSS selector, that sort of thing. So you don't have to tell Playwright what type of selector you're using, although you can if you need to. So if you're using an ID, you can tell it you're using an ID. But for certain selector types, you don't have to. It's clever enough to understand what you're trying to do. You can also, as I mentioned, chain elements together. So if you're navigating through the DOM, you can do that in a single statement rather than multiple statements to get where you need to go. Playwright code gen. I'll talk about this in a minute. This is a sort of a playground to allow you to generate Playwright code by navigating. It's a recorder essentially by navigating through an application. So I'll show you that shortly. Interception of network traffic. So this is a really useful feature. So again, with modern web applications, there's often lots of things going on behind the scenes. There's API calls, there's XHR requests, and that sort of thing. Lots of stuff going on in the background. So, and Cypress has a similar feature. So Playwright allows us to block and intercept that traffic. And where this becomes really useful is when you want to speed up your tests. For example, if you have a long list lots of, a long list of items returned in a web application. Maybe for your particular test, you're only interested in the first one, then you could intercept the API response, which returns that list, and change it on the fly. Just display the first one, which is returned. It's also useful if you want to mock out particular error responses. So it's not always possible to knock out a backend system, but if you want to test how your web application handles getting a 500 response code back, again, you can mock that out. So you can pretend that you've got a 500 back and see how your web application handles that. The other way I've seen it used is to block all images that are returned to a web application. So again, if you're only concerned about the functionality in your test, you might not be concerned about a number of images that are returned on that particular web page. So you can do things like block all requests which have a .jpeg in or something like that. So none of those images get returned on your page. So your page loads much quicker. File upload and download. So again, this is supported out of the box. So there's no need to use kind of third-party libraries to support this. It's quite straightforward to do with Playwright. And mobile device emulation. So I realize I'm going through these relatively quickly. Mobile device emulation. So Playwright does not support testing of mobile apps. You'll have to use something else for that. But what you can do is emulate things like screen sizes and time zones and geolocations. So if you want to check what your web application, how it works on an iPhone, you can spin up a new context as part of your browser, change the screen size to that of an iPhone 10 or 11, 12, whatever it is. Equally, you can set things like geolocation and time zone. So if you want to check, what happens when a response comes back in a different time zone, and how your web application acts in different time zones, then you can do that using context. And built-in assertions. So Playwright has a number of built-in assertions using sort of the expect syntax. So expect text to equal that sort of thing. Expect a value to be null. So you don't have to use a third-party assertions library. You can get away for the most part with using sort of Playwright's built-in assertions. So limitations. Obviously, no tool is perfect, and just like every other tool, Playwright does have its limitations. So there's no API support. You can't call APIs using Playwright. I think that's one of the great features about Cypress, is that you can call APIs, and that's really useful for setting up data and logging users in and that sort of thing. So if you want to do that with Playwright, you'll have to use it in conjunction with another library. So there's also no mobile app support. As I mentioned, you can't run your tests on a mobile app yet. So I think there is an open issue on GitHub to possibly look at this in the future, and maybe one day you'll be able to write Playwright tests against a web app, but it's not possible at the moment. So it does describe itself as cross-browser, but it's not completely cross-browser. You are limited to Chromium, Firefox, and WebKit. You can't test on IE, and you can't test on Opera or older versions of Edge. So as it is the new kid on the block. It hasn't been around for too long, so there is limited documentation. Actually, the documentation that Playwright provide is really good. It's really solid. What it lacks at the moment is the kind of what I'd call community-led documentation. All of those getting started with Playwright, blog posts, and you know, those sort of thing, videos, which, you know, are there in abundance for things like Cypress and Selenium WebDriver. So, you know, there is documentation, there is stuff out there, but you are limited compared to some of the other sort of longer the libraries which have been around for a bit longer. And there is a lack of support currently for you know, on cross-browser tools like Browser Stack and Source Labs. Again, this all comes with it being a new tool, and all of this stuff is almost certainly going to come in the future. So watch this space. So I appreciate I've talked a lot and very quickly. So I'm going to stop the slides, and I'm going to jump over to VS Code and the terminal, and I'm going to run a quick test so we can just see it in action. So I'm just going to make this a bit bigger. So in here, I can just initiate my file, and I'm going to install Playwright. So this will take, if you're installing for the first time, this takes a couple of minutes. And the reason it takes a couple of minutes is because it starts downloading those drivers that I mentioned earlier. So you can see now that it's currently working on downloading Chromium. If you've previously downloaded Playwright, you might already have these installed, and therefore the actual install of Playwright is fairly quick. They actually get stored in a central location for all instances of Playwright to use. So if you have multiple projects using Playwright, they're all going to be using the same instances. They get saved in this in your library caches, MS Playwright, and you can see it's just finished doing the Chromium one, and now it's moving on to Firefox. So whilst it downloads those, are there any questions at this point? Don't know if there are any in the chat or not.
I think there's a couple in the chat now, Ryan.
Okay, got to remember how to get to the chat. So someone's asked, does it support BDD framework as well? Yes, I think it does. I haven't actually tried it with BDD, but I'm sure it does. I'll see if I can check in a minute. So I think that's downloaded. So I'll share my screen again. Hopefully you can still see my terminal here. So we now have our drivers downloaded, so we can now use those. So I'm going to jump over to VS Code. I'm going to open our new directory.
One more question in the chat, Ryan. Does it have Docker image for WebKit to run in the pipeline?
It does, yeah. So you can run everything. It's a good point. So there's quite extensive documentation on how to use it inside Docker. There's also good documentation on CI/CD. So they've got examples of hooking it up using, you know, GitHub Actions or Circle CI or Azure DevOps. So yes, there is a pre-built image for Playwright, so you can use that. So I'm going to create a new file, and let's just call it first test.
Another quick one, Ryan. Is there documentation for Python Playwright?
Python, was that?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, yes, there is. So there's actually, so this might be a good opportunity to, before we write anything. So this is the documentation. There's a whole host of things on there, you know, page objects and so on. And this is the documentation specific for the node library. You can also, if I just Playwright Python, you've got exactly the same documentation, all aimed at using it with Python. So while we're here, Python's quite an interesting one because it supports synchronous and async. So for the Python examples, you've mostly got two different examples, one running it with async IO and one with synchronous. So yeah, there's documentation, the same with Java and C# as well. And that's probably actually a good point to show you. If I jump back to Visual Code, before we write any code, what we can also do with Playwright is mpxcodegen. So we can use this mpxcodegen. I forget, it might be mpx Playwright codegen. We'll soon find out. Screen's frozen, right? See if this launches. Yeah. So what this codegen launches is two browser instances. The first one is this nice Playwright Inspector pop-up. And the second one is the website that we want to go to. So you can see as I move around this website, it's picking up the element that I'm on. And what I can do is I can start interacting with this web page. So if I click in here and type JavaScript, and then hit search, you can see on this window here, it's logging all of those interactions that I'm having. So it's actually building me a Playwright test in this window here. It's recording everything. So you can see that it's navigating to the page. it's clicking on the search box, it's filling the search box with the word JavaScript, and then it's clicking on the search button, and it wraps it all nicely in a JavaScript file for me. So I could essentially copy this into my IDE and run this test, and it will even in certain circumstances try and write assertions for you. It'll comment them out in here, but it will try and identify things you might be doing. So whether if for example your interaction goes to another endpoint, it might try and validate what that endpoint is. The great thing about this as well is I've written this, and it's written it in JavaScript for me. But if I want to have a look at what it will look like in Python, I can just change it, and there we have it. So this is the Python example, and you can see here that it's trying to assert that the page URL is this particular value. Likewise, if I wanted to see what it looked like in Java or C#, then I've got the option to do that. So this is a really great way of getting started with Playwright and understanding how it generates code. You can see that it's built a new context, and off the back of that context, we've created a new page based on, context, new page, and so on. So this is a really great tool for getting started. Back to our script. This will stop, but you can pause this as well, by the way, so you can then interact with whatever you want to do without recording those steps. And you can find sort of the relevant selectors that you need. Anyway, let me close that down. Close that down as well. We'll go back to our test. For the purposes of time, I'm going to copy a script, and then I'll talk through it. Okay, so this is the script that we saw in the slide previously. And as I mentioned, in this instance, we're going to use the Chromium driver. The first thing we do is create a browser instance based on that driver. So we're launching the browser using the Chromium driver. And then from here, we're not using context. So you don't have to use context. I'm going to go straight and create a page off of that browser. If I wanted to use context, I could do something like this. New context. And then in that instance, my page would be context, new page. I'll get rid of that for now, and I'll change that back to browser. So this is just a single browser instance and a single page off of that browser instance. So once we've got our browser and our page, we can navigate to where we need to go. Like I mentioned, we're going to go to this this test to do web application, which some of you may be familiar with. Just allows you to enter to-dos. Close that down. And then we're going to enter a new to-do, and we are going to press enter on our keyboard, and eventually we're going to close the browser. So if any of you have been at demos for web automation before, you know that these scripts are really quick and that it's quite difficult to actually see if anything's going on. So we can use this slow-mo option here, and let's just change that to 100. And this will slow our test down. So it should make it a bit easier for us to, for you guys to see what's going on we could also do something like, before we do that, let's add a screenshot as well. So let's call that. I think that's the right syntax. So now that we've got our script, let's try and run it. So node first test. Don't know whether this will launch in which screen it's going to launch in. So I'll try and move it. Okay, there we go. So that was very, very quick. I don't know whether I can slow that down anymore. There you go. You can just about see that there, but it's also given us a little screenshot here, which is taken. So you can see that we've been able to navigate to the to page, enter explore Playwright as our to do, and then we've closed the browser at the end. So that's probably there's one more little thing that if we've got time, I know we're a bit short. So one other thing you can do, I won't show you, but I'll just explain it. So you can actually run your test against multiple browsers. Let's see if I can show you the example actually. Might be able to find this quickly. I don't know if I can, but basically you can automatically get your tests to run on multiple browsers, one after the other. So there it is in the documentation. So you can basically in this line here set it to loop through an array of browsers. So you can have your browser set as Chromium, Firefox, and WebKit, and then you can just launch this single test, and it will iterate through each of those browsers, run your test, and then run it on the next browser along, and so on. So that's a really nice way and a really simple way of just being able to sort of run your test cross-browser very, very quickly. So in terms of examples, that's kind of a basic test. So I know we've only got not very long left, so I'll open this back up to any questions that you guys might have.
Quite a few there in the chat, Ryan. I think there's 2 or 3 that have just come through.
Docker image is a documentation for Playwright. Does it support or wait for particular requests and then execute like site tests? So does it support to wait for particular request and then execute like site process CY.wait? I don't know whether you so it's got the sort of inbuilt waiting, and then you can use things like .then to wait for things to happen before you do your next. So you can use the standard kind of promise setup stuff that you'd use for Node and JavaScript. I can't recall whether it's got a specific wait command. I think it probably has, but I can double check. Does it support multi-super domains in a single test? Does it record video? Yes. Sorry, I should say these out loud. Does it support multiple super domains in a single test? I'm not quite sure what that means. So you can, so you could launch. I think what you mean by could you launch multiple applications? And the answer is yes, because you could do that off of context. So you could launch 2 completely different applications on separate contexts, the separate pages, and do things that way. And does it record? Yes, you can record. So it's got built in, much like Cypress does. You can record. There is a command for recording your sessions. I know we showed the screenshots, but we didn't go through record. What about reports? Will it generate automatically? No, it doesn't generate any reporting automatically, but you're free to kind of hook it up with what sort of reporting library or tool you're using. So if you're using some Mock Awesome or Test Report or something like that, you can hook it up to those to generate your reports, but there's nothing out of the box. Is there anything else? I think that's all of them answered. I can see, David, you've replied about using it with Cucumber. I thought that was the case, so thank you for replying. I think that's all the questions answered, though.
Perfect. Is there any other questions from anyone else? Anything outstanding that you'd like to ask? Feel free to unmute or drop in the chat.
I appreciate that. That was very much a whistle-stop tour of Playwright, and I'm certainly no expert, but it's quite a nice tool to use. It's good fun.
Perfect, brilliant. We'll really appreciate that, Ryan. There's a lot of practical uses there, benefits over, similar tools that have been used for a long time or are being favoured for a lot of companies at the moment. And good to get your insight as to where it's useful and also the limitations as well as to where it might not be best to use. So really appreciate that, guys. If you do have any other questions, feel free to drop them on the message board on the event. I'm sure Ryan will be able to come back to you in due course. And yeah, thanks again, Ryan, for the run through and the introduction to Playwright.
No problem at all. Thank you for having me, and thank you everyone for listening.